Okay, welcome to this talk. My name's Denbigh White. I'm Global Director of Customer Success for Next DLP. For those of you that have come to have a thinly veiled hard sell vendor presentation, I'm going to be a little bit disappointed here because I don't work for the sales team and I'm a bit fastidious in that you come to these seminars to hear something vaguely interesting around information security rather than a product pitch, so that's not what you're going to get today. Awfully sorry if that's what you were expecting, so no. But what I want to do is talk about the VASA ship, which is one of my favourite topics, and lessons in information security that we can take from it today. Because in the olden days when you did information security talks, we were all talking about castles and walls, and I'm sure we're all thoroughly bored to tears around the problems of a wall and castle mentality in information security, defense in depth, zero trust, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And also walls don't necessarily protect against Vikings, as we're talking about kind of a Swedish naval boat. Hark back to history, 993, Vikings ransacked this castle, Bamborough Castle, looting, pillaging, burning, and killing everyone inside. So I think we can pretty much agree walls don't work all that well, and castles don't either. But we're going to be talking about ships instead today. We're not going to be talking about the ship on the left, which is the HMS Daring, fantastic British war vessel. There is a story in relation to that, but that's more supply chain. It's about slippy floors in the galley. We're not doing that one today, but if you know the background behind that, it's a very expensive and very pertinent lesson for the MOD in not buying slippy floors, but buying non-slippy floors when you're at sea and you're cooking with knives and stuff. We're going to, generally not too great and was a bit of an expensive mistake on behalf of the shipbuilders there. But we are going to be talking about the ship over here, which is the VASA ship. But before we do that, I wanted to do a little bit of historical background in here, so I'm going to take you back to the 17th century. And you had a king of Sweden called King Adolf Gustaf II, and he was part of a dynasty, the Vasa dynasty. And like a lot of Scandinavian kings at the time, he inherited a lot of things, a lot of wealth, a lot of countries. He also inherited a number of wars, namely with the Danes, those pesky Danes down south, with the Polish, and with the Russians as well. So he actually acceded to the throne whilst at war. And his name of the game then was big naval dominance, great ships, great warships, and that was what he really loved. Winning wars in the north of Europe, demonstrating his Scandinavian Viking prowess against those horrible Danes, essentially. And he had a quite difficult situation in his tenure. Now, at the 18 of the 21 years before he died, he was at war with somebody else. So he was somewhat fractious, should we say, as a king. Didn't get on well with others, didn't play nicely. So what he did was, he didn't set to work yet. Basically, he said, I need some more ships. So he contracted his shipbuilders, didn't build the ships himself. He said to his Admiral Fleming, I'd like you to build 4 new warships. I want 2 big ships and 2 small ships, and I would like them yesterday, please. Please build them immediately. So the shipbuilder set to work and started building these ships, felling the Swedish forest down as he went, kind of lots and lots of wood, started building these ships. Unfortunately, later on in the year of 1625, the Swedish Navy lost in battle. Well, actually they didn't. They crashed 10 of their warships off a bay because they sailed a little bit into shallow waters and they sank. And the king changed his mind and said, you know what? I need you to actually change the spec of these ships. Don't build 4 warships, too small, too large. They'd started on the small ones. I need you to build 2 large warships. Get to work. So these shipbuilders had already spent 6-8 months starting to build these ships. They then went, okay, right, we've got to make these small ships bigger. Right, let's get on to work like this. So compound to that, they were building these ships. He then hears through the grapevine of, the kingly version of social media at the time, I'm guessing, that the Danes, sworn enemy of King Gustaf, hated that guy. He was probably related to him, but still hated him nonetheless, was building a larger warship. And like many kings and leaders and dictators, there was a certain level of ego involved in this conversation. The Danes were building a bigger ship. This will not do. The King of Denmark's one cannot be bigger than my one. Terrible. So he said, right, what I want you to do is this ship that you're building now, I want to change the scope of that again, please. I need you to make it longer, bigger, and could you put a second layer of cannons? I want 2 layers of cannons on this boat, just another deck on the top. Do it now, I need it built yesterday. The shipbuilders were like, oh, this is somewhat problematic. We're going to have to cut some more trees down. Actually, we've never built a ship with 2 cannon decks before. It's a great idea, but no one's ever done it. So they were like, actually, there's this thing about buoyancy and stability that we have some concerns about, King. And the king was like, you know what? I'm the king. You're not the king. I want a ship with 2 cannon decks on. And now I think about it, I also want a ship with a ornately oak carved frieze of my family history along the top of the deck around the side as well. So when I'm coming with my cannons, I want them to not only fear me, but fear my entire family history. The Vasa dynasty is sailing to Denmark. It's not that far away as well. They could potentially have ridden, probably taken less time. But I want them to see my family dynasty. And I want it in oak, I want it carved, I want it ornate. Engineers were. Oak weighs quite a bit, and you want this at the top of the ship. I'm king, you're king, fair enough. So they set to work. They said, okay, you're king, let's do this, fair enough. So this is the build process. As a lot of Scandinavian build projects go, and as you can imagine, you have something highly complicated. Your king, or in my case, my wife, says, please, I really need this triple wardrobe with kind of bedside table, I need this built yesterday, build it now, and this is a common site. This wasn't the actual shipbuilder. Such flooring wasn't necessarily invented at the time. And you notice the anachronism with the electrical slot there, so please forgive the slides. There's some creative license in this. But they were trying to build this. And additionally, halfway through the shipbuilding process, the actually master shipbuilder, Jakobsen, he died. He just left the project. Very selfish of him, and left it to his understudies and the subcontractors, who had even less experience in shipbuilding. And as with many projects, there wasn't a written project plan, there wasn't design schematics, it was an entirely new design. So they were kind of just winging it like jazz. They say we need it this long, we'll make it this long, and we want the frieze and the cannons and the stuff, let's see what we can do. So the testing process. Now, those of you who have a background in shipbuilding, which I'm sure many people at this cybersecurity conference have, will understand the somewhat quite complicated calculations of buoyancy and stability. But just for a refresher, I know that you already know this, and I certainly do, as evidenced by the fact I've got these notes here to make sure I get it right. I will just talk a little bit about what this diagram means. So buoyancy, as you all know, is the upward force exerted on a fluid of a submerged object which is equal to the weight of the fluid displaced by the object. Simple, right? You push something into a bath, it displaces the water, and that's the buoyant force. As evidenced by Archimedes, many, many years before, with the crown, remember in school, eureka, eureka, we now know how to weigh gold when it's a kind of odd shape, right? The formula of that is B equals PVG, where B is the buoyant force, B is the density of water, and V is the volume of water displaced by the hull. And throw into the mix the gravitational force as well, because we're all subject to gravity. Simple, simple. So the stability of a ship is the ability of the ship to resist capsizing or rolling over in rough seas. So we calculate this very cleverly, as evidenced in this really clear diagram here. So I hope you're following. Using a stability curve, which shows the relationship between the ship's displacement and its righting movement. The righting movement is the torque created by the buoyancy force acting on the hull, which brings the ship back into an upright position when it tilts. The righting movement can be calculated with the simple formula M equals GZ, where M is the righting movement, G is the weight of the ship, and Z is the distance between the metacenter and the center of gravity. The metacenter is the center of the ship here, and the center of gravity depends on the weighting of the ship. Generally speaking, the lower down the weight is displaced on a ship, the lower the center of gravity, the more stable, the lower it sits in the water. The higher the center of gravity, there's weight at the top of the ship, less center of gravity. So that's how you work things out. And you'd think, Archimedes, as I've mentioned, was many, many years before this. Remember, 17th century. So you think, they would have had access to these calculations. And, did they do their calculations when they were building the ship like this? Answer to that question is, no, they did not. They did the tried and tested get 30 of your mates approach. So what they did was, ship was half built, the Vasa, cannons weren't loaded, armaments weren't loaded, the frieze had not been completed yet, it was still, they're getting the nose right on Vasa's mother-in-law just to make sure it was nice. So what they did, 30 of their mates, bobbing around in Stockholm Harbour, Vasa ship half constructed, on one side of the ship, and they said, okay boys, run to that side of the ship. Now when I usually do this talk, I run across the room. I sprained my ankle on Friday, so I'm going to limp across the room, but just imagine I'm running. Run across the room, okay. Now quick, turn round, run the other way. And run the other way. And they did that. That was their testing of stability and seaworthiness of the ship during the build process. Now, we can all see that that's not as scientific a method as the great formula that we all thoroughly understand. However, even then, with no cannons, no armaments, no frieze on the side, the ship almost sank in still water. It just almost capsized. Yet, hey, you're the king. We need a Vasa ship. We need to stick it to the Danes. So, what was the result of this outstanding build process that involved a shipbuilder that died, changing scope, no actual schematics and plans, and people running back and forth across a desk? I asked Midjourney because, let's be with the times, AI, videos, have to throw it in, don't you? Please provide me with a stupidly overarmed 1600s battleship concept design. I'm sure the king would have done this had he had access to Midjourney and AI image generation, printed off the image and said, build me that. And this is what it came up with, which is actually not too dissimilar to the actual ship design, the Vasa. So, top trumps card of the Vasa, because it is quite an impressive ship. We'll get to what happened later. Its displacement, that's how heavy it is for you non-nautical folk, was 1,210 tons. It was 69 meters long. It was 52.5 meters high. You can see, if you think about the ratios there, you're starting to wonder about some problems here in the dimensions of this ship. Its draft, that's how deep it sits in the water, was 4.8 meters. Think about these dimensions. Its crew on board, 145 sailors plus 300 soldiers, and this is the bit the king loves. His armament, 64 guns, 48 24-pound guns. I'm sorry I couldn't convert this into metric. I'm more of a metric person, but 8 3-pound guns, 2 1-pound guns, and 6 of these, which I couldn't find an adequate translation for, that are called Sturmstücken, which sound truly terrifying. I think the loose translation is, I think there's some kind of mortar that they had on board. So this is the biggest, baddest, most powerful Swedish badass warship Europe had ever seen. I'm foreshadowing here, albeit briefly. So what was the result of this awesome project? Was it naval dominance with the Swedish king? Was it the greatest warship the world had ever seen? 2 decks, not 1 deck. No one else had got that, awesome. An example of just-in-time production. We're crowbarring the terms in here. A firm 2 fingers up to those pesky rotten Danes. Or was it an example of excellent delivered agile project 374 years before agile was even a thing? Because if you change scope, don't really have a plan, that's agile, right? Or so certain companies I've worked with might think. For clarity, I realise that's not agile. Agile is a very serious thing and an awesome project methodology, but not this. So, on the 11th of August, 1628, the Vasa left Stockholm Harbour. Well, no, it left Stockholm Harbour. The ship hit a minor crosswind. When I say left Stockholm Harbour, it didn't technically actually leave Stockholm Harbour. It went about 300 metres through Stockholm Harbour, hit a minor crosswind, the first one, little wobble. The second, and we're talking very, very minor crosswind, and then promptly sank. The captain of the ship survived and was immediately jailed for incompetence. Sound familiar to, So there was an investigation, of course, and the investigation went in a very Swedish, very of-the-time kind of way. So what went wrong? Here we have the stability and buoyancy, but it's not all that. So the investigation went a little bit like this. The king heard, he was off fighting the Poles at the time. He was in Prussia, fighting his Polish war. He had a messenger, Gala, how's my Vasa coming? Are everyone totally intimidated by my naval dominance and the history of my family and my 64 guns and my Sturmstücken, whatever they are, they sounded cool, so I said, put them on the ship. And they said, well, actually, no, king. We hit a slight project snag. It sank. He said, right, I want the head of the person responsible. This is gross incompetence. I want an investigation. I want this to happen yesterday. I need a slide deck for the board immediately. Oh no, sorry, that's later on in the talk. So the investigation took place. And the captain was asked a number of questions, and his answers are actually quite funny, and they were recorded in the historical notes, which I have here. They asked him, clearly you failed to secure the armaments correctly, Captain. The reason this sank was because the cannons were like on wheels and they were rolling all over the deck, and it's your fault. Captain's response was, stab me with 1,000 knives in my head if those cannons weren't lashed down. This guy really took it personally. We've all dealt with auditors, and often a yes or no, and I can confirm this or not answer is generally the better response. I've yet to have a conversation with EY or KPMG where stab me with 1,000 eyes if those compensating controls are not adequate. It doesn't necessarily ring true, but he really committed to this. So he said then, well, you were intoxicated and you were clearly drunk. So you were drunk sailing, which is a bad thing. And again, he says, cut me into 1,000 pieces if they have had any alcohol whatsoever. And it was true, actually. Swedish vessels usually had certain drinking taking place on board, but it so happens that before the launch of the Vasa, there was a church service that everyone literally came straight from church onto the boat and on, so there was no actual drinking taking place, so alcohol wasn't the reason at all. So then he said, was the ship stable? There was obviously a problem with the design of the ship. So they pull in the shipbuilder's replacement, because obviously they couldn't bring in the shipbuilder because he was dead, and that'd be a little bit gross, because he'd been dead for a number of years at that point. So they said, okay, so clearly you've built a defective ship. Your buoyancy's not right, your schematics are not right, and you've caused all this death and the embarrassment to the king, and he's certainly not happy. And the answer from the shipbuilder is true of any architect or somebody that's done a design. He says, well, I built the ship exactly to the king's specifications, to the letter. The king wanted this, and we built it as he said. So the inquiry was closed with no fault found and lesson learnt, and the Vasa sank to the bottom of Stockholm Harbour, was covered in silt until it was found in the 1960s, perfectly preserved, we'll get to that bit later, and is available in a museum in Stockholm, which is awesome. So, why did the Vasa sink? I've got a why did the Vasa sink section here. So, there's the excessive time pressure. King at war on all fronts, attacked on multiple fronts, do it this way, do it that way. Changing needs, the king changed his scope, changed his requirements, changed what he wanted to do a number of times. A lack of technical specifications. Nobody really knew what they were doing, and they were just trying to, make a tactical change to the security of the nation, without any real plan. There wasn't a project plan, certainly wasn't. Excessive innovation, that frieze on the side of the sculpture of his family, entirely unnecessary. Didn't necessarily make the ship any tougher or grander or greater. Secondary innovations, again, the frieze, requirements creep, and a lack of scientific methods in testing. And most importantly, ignoring the obvious. 30 men running back and forth across a desk, almost sinking a ship with no armaments that's half built, should give you an idea that the fully built one that's even heavier on top than it is on bottom might not last its maiden voyage. Now, these headings, do they sound like vaguely familiar for information security world at all? When I haven't always worked for a vendor. In fact, this is one of my first forays into vendor land. I used to purchase the products and be sitting where you are now. And you have these time pressures, and you hire people, you try and get things, and then the scope changes, the budget changes and stuff, Very, very similar, right? Or is it just the projects that I worked on? So there are some lessons we can learn from the Vasa ship. And, we could do the COBIT 5 response. Rest assured, we're not going to go through this. This is highlighting what we're not going to do. There are frameworks where you can understand, hey, this is how we should have done it. Let's fill out this spreadsheet. Let's discuss this spreadsheet. Let's spend 6 months pondering the spreadsheet, and let's, file it in the too difficult box and go on to the next project. So we're not going to necessarily look at those during this talk, but you can do it that way. But there are some overarching principles here that I wanted to talk about, things that I see in the industry that are stumbling blocks for us in achieving security and actually doing the best we can. Product aside. So sometimes we lack the visibility of the whole picture. Sometimes, you have siloed technology teams. You've got the access control team, the privileged access team, the SIEM team and stuff, and you laser focus in your thing, and you're doing the best thing. You're implementing a solution that does this. And what you get is an amazingly secure door that doesn't really do much. Yes, it protects the wheelie bins potentially, but they could be lifted across the wall. Do we rarely take a step back to look at where this sits in the wider risk picture for our companies, or are we just looking to deal with the thing that's right in front of us at the time? Sometimes, we have a tendency as an industry to try and be too clever. In the Vasa ship, that was certainly the case, over-innovation of decks and, freezers and stuff like this. But also, sometimes when we speak of this lock here, I stayed in a hotel last night, and this lock, great gimmick, fantastic, Not so good if there's a fire in the hotel and it's dark and, I've had a beer the night before or something and, and I'm trying to get out and I burn to death in my hotel room. And sometimes, do we sometimes have a tendency to over-engineer things, kind of just because we can? We've got our rock star security engineer that can do like Python, Go, Ruby and whatever, and he says, you know what, I can, automate all this and I'll write something like super duper clever, and I'll, not comment it because, that's how it goes. And that we might not necessarily need to do. Again, it's about taking a step back and understanding, are we achieving what we want to achieve, or are we just, overcomplicating things for the sake of overcomplicating? Do we sometimes forget the end of what do we want to secure, why do we want to secure it, or do we get stuck in the details of specifically, let's do something clever? So what can we learn from this? Firstly, time to value needs to include value. Again, one of the issues of the Vasa was the time constraints, and they were like, throw together something super duper fast. And it's more haste, less speed. If we throw together a tactical solution, again, I've worked in kind of CISO's office of kind of a regulated industry, and you chase audit findings, and you have to do audit closures, right? And you go, well, we've got our action item to close this specific audit finding. We need to do it in this time-constrained area. We'll do this one specific thing really quickly, which will cover off that specific finding. But does it benefit the wider company necessarily? Does it benefit the wider threat picture and the security picture? Are we trying to do things too quickly and not necessarily doing them with the quality that we would hope to? Value doesn't necessarily equal friction. Sometimes in security we'd be like, hey, this product's awesome, our security is awesome, we've stopped every user from doing anything in our environment, we've locked it down, and that's kind of great. Or sometimes with kind of technology that we have, there's the whole let's buy another firewall. Again, Fortinet, sorry, firewalls are awesome and they're essential, you should buy them naturally. But should we put extra layers of security over something that should be fundamentally redesigned, or a concept of the way in which we do security that should be rethought in some way? Are we layering things on top? And that speaks to the skill shortage to a certain extent, not to the whole extent. I'm not going to say this is solved, but if we are a company, and I've worked with companies that are like this, and for companies that are like this, that purchase 1,000 different bits of vendor technology. They go to a show like this and they go, oh, that sounds cool, I'll buy that, I'll slot it in the data center in the 42 rack, or these days I'll spin it up in the cloud and the cloud thing. All different technologies, all different user manners, all different ways of operating, 25 different bits of technology. And then we go, oh, actually, we've got a skill shortage, none of our staff know how to use this. There's a balance point there of understanding, you can't get one security engineer that knows 50 products necessarily, or if you do, hold on to them because they'll be quitting soon. So I think we need to understand multiple technologies can introduce friction, both in the hiring process, the operational process, but also in how we do security. Do we necessarily need to layer on, cover a gap of a bit of technology we currently have that doesn't do the business by buying something else, or can we think a little bit strategically and a little bit laterally about this? So yeah, and technology-enabled friction as well. If we just block people, back to that castle at the start of the presentation, I sometimes describe users as water. And by users, I also include security professionals as well. Sometimes we'd like to exclude ourselves from, we're perfect. We never do anything kind of sketchy to do with security, of course. If you have a block inside things and you say, I'm blocking you from doing this thing, it leaves the users going, oh, well, I've done things the wrong way, but what's the right way? Has that been communicated to me in policy? Is there a right way to do this? I always used to have to send massive CSV files, like all of the audit evidence stuff. You send it to kind of your auditors, KPMG, EY, whoever it is, right? And you go, oh, I'll send this in an email. Oh no, you can't send it via an email. There's a secure data room, and that changes regularly as vendors change and stuff, and you don't necessarily know this. So it's about facilitating the communication with the user base to introduce value, to introduce kind of a collaborative working between security and your end user base, rather than friction in being kind of the team that likes to say no, go away, you're really bad at computers and we don't like you, please stop calling us. That's not necessarily how we should do things. And in fairness, the industry's changing for the better in that respect. Also just kind of responding to the things in front of our noses all the time. There's the phrase, a goal without a plan is just a wish. And, a project plan, let's make it secure, is not necessarily a thoroughly devised project plan. So some companies just throw endless amounts of money at security. They buy every piece of technology, they stack it, it doesn't work together, and they don't really understand what they're wanting to achieve. And that's really important. In the Vasa time as well, they were just throwing decks on top of ships and then wondering why it capsized. Again, do we do this sometimes with our security projects? Hey, this is new and fancy, let's throw some money at it, if we can get the money from the CFO, of course. That's another question. So an understanding of kind of where you are as a company or where you are in your information security program first, before you try and start solving problems, because if you don't understand the problems you have, then how are you going to solve the actual wider problems? Because if you don't do that, you're just throwing money into a security wish, wishing well, and kind of hoping for the best, which, might work, but probably won't. So, in conclusion, over the Vasa ship, if you are considering purchasing a complicated Swedish manufactured item in wood, a ship or something else, make sure that you have a good scope, get documentation for assembly, just in case the shipbuilder dies. If you've bought a complicated Swedish manufactured item in wood, only use it as designed. Don't try and change the scope and build things much larger and shorter. Interesting point about the Vasa that I failed to mention is when they enlarge in the ship design, you remember I said 2 small ships, 1 large ship, then it was 2 large ships, and then it was 1 mega ship. They'd already started the bow construction. And those of you that are au fait in naval shipbuilding design in wood and 17th century ships will know that the bottom of a ship needs to be of 1 single piece of wood for it to maintain its rigidity and stability. They'd already cut these bits of wood for the ship. They had the time constraint. So what they did instead was they nailed some bits of wood together to extend it, which wasn't great. So had the Vasa not sunk in its maiden voyage because it was heavier on the top than on the bottom, as evidenced by those great calculations I went through earlier, it probably would have snapped in half in some current. So, not the best ship design. But moving on to today, if you want to secure data, have secure data, firstly have a plan. Don't do without thinking about what you're going to do. Don't engineer legacy technical debt-ridden technologies and kind of embrace the future. I'm not saying throw out all of your legacy technologies, certainly don't, and a lot of companies can't do that. Absolutely not. But think to yourself, am I spending more time making this old thing work than it would take to take a step back, have a breath, and think about how we might want to do this differently, especially considering the world of security and IT is a heck of a lot different today than it was even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 30 odd years ago, where some people are using 30-year-old kits, which is, again, certain use cases perfectly fine. There is a use case for mainframes still. I'll say that now. I know it's potentially sometimes an unpopular opinion, but mainframes are awesome. But whatever you do, have a plan, test the plan, and document the plan, because you never know when your shipbuilder is going to drop dead or quit and go to work for somebody else, especially in cybersecurity. So ensure that somebody else is able to pick up and somebody knows and the reporting is in place. So if you want to find out more about the Vasa ship, which arguably was the more interesting part of this talk, it is located in Stockholm, right there. You get to see the actual ship. So they unearthed it, it was virtually preserved, and it's inside this custom-built museum that you walk through, history of the Vasa, an explanation of its building, which is far superior to the talk that I've delivered to you today, so apologies for that. And it's a great day out in Stockholm. And Oscar, who's our guy on the stand, lives in Stockholm, so you could say hi to Oscar as well. He lives there. He's not in the room, so he didn't know, I just outed where he lives. But on the other hand, and they're making me do this, if you want to find about fast time, real to value, protecting data without the pain, a new way of doing things, absolute minimum friction, security plans and not wishes, or if you don't want to talk about those things, I'll be on the stand, you want to talk about Star Trek or what you thought of the Sandman series, The Crown, or basically anything like that, we're super approachable. We're the other side of there, we're next DLP. The sales guys can talk to you about salesy stuff. If you have any technical questions about how it works in the real world, I work with current customers in security and analysis using our tool. By all means, approach us. That is the limit of the sales pitch that I'm going to do today because I don't believe in them. I do believe in the product. That's why I moved from being a customer to working for this cyber vendor, which I still find super odd, by the way. No one invites me for free lunches now, which is terrible. I thought it was my engaging personality that meant they wanted to talk to me, but it was the fact I work for Deutsche Bank. Yeah, how terrible. But yeah, please do come. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. I hope if you hadn't heard about the Vasa, it's given you some insight into an absolutely really cool 17th century warship. It's a great story. It's a great object lesson in project planning, in security design and stuff as well, because a lot of that stuff, the egos, the lack of planning, the requirement shift in the scope are true now as they were back then. Thank you very much, and I'm being told my time is over, and I've nailed it. Thank you very much.